Hey, welcome to the Engaged Truth podcast and YouTube channel. We're so glad that you guys can join us today. I'm real excited about today's episode as I have a special guest with me today, Eric Hernandez. He is a speaker, apologist, and debater, and he works with Texas Baptist. And I'm real glad to have him join us today. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing good, thank you. How about yourself?
Oh, doing well. I bring on Eric today as a friend I met. I think it was 2018 at the CIA Cross-Examine Instructor Academy. I think it was around then, right?
Yeah, sounds about right.
All right, awesome. Now, Eric, you're with Texas Baptist. Can you tell me a little more about what you do with them?
Yeah, so I'm the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and that basically encompasses anything from, one of the main things is putting together what we call the Unapologetic Evangelism Conferences. And those are conferences revolving around apologetics and meeting the needs of what the church has, revolving certain issues. And then anything from on top of that, going to churches and doing training with church leaders, or even to youth groups, to the main staff at churches and at bigger churches I've done, and even just doing online discussions like this, or doing debates, whether in person, online, and talking with other people in any way to get the gospel and the good news out there.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And I'm on the tip of Texas, so we're still connected with Texas Baptists around here. I attend Coronado Baptist. So yeah, I kind of want to even back up even further on your story of how did you even get into this focus as far as ministry and study goes with apologetics?
Yeah. So apologetics overall, the story that people have heard before from me is, so freshman year of college, I take my first philosophy class, and I really enjoyed it because I got to ask questions, which was not usual for me, especially being in youth group. I'd get in trouble for asking questions. And I later came to find out that my professor was an atheist. Nevertheless, I appreciated the class. He was very even-handed. He wasn't biased, at least not when he taught, and things of that nature. And I wanted to take another class in philosophy, and every one of my peers warned me to not take Professor Pena's class, because they said if you take his class, you might lose your faith. And my thought was, well, sign me up, because I had the belief that if God existed, then I shouldn't be afraid to learn, and truth isn't going to contradict who he is. So we shouldn't be afraid to learn or seek truth, especially, Christ being the way, the truth, and the life. Now, the pivotal moment for me was when he came in, and this is how I got into really getting into apologetics, more particularly philosophy, was he one day walked into class and pretended like he pulled out an antidepressant pill from his pocket. And he said, now religion wants us to believe in something like a soul, which according to Christianity is something that's immaterial, and it's where your thoughts and moods and your emotions are. He said, but the problem is, if I were to take this pill, how is it that something tiny and physical can affect our material? Because for Christians, this is a thing that gives us hope in an afterlife. It's a thing that when we pass away, we can see our friends and family that have gone before us, and we can have that hope in a resurrection. But if this tiny pill, if it's physical, and if my emotions and moods and thoughts and beliefs are in my soul, which is not physical, then how is it that this pill can affect my soul? Because every time we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing. And every time we look at the body, all we see are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, these basic chemical elements. But you never find anything like a soul. He said, so how do we explain that? And he said, well, it's quite simple. He said, I'll tell you the answer. The answer is simple. It's that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a brain and body, a meat machine, and there is nothing more to that. And we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing these fairy tales. Class dismissed. So that for me really shook me, because up until that point, I hadn't really heard a substantial or good objection against Christianity. I had heard a lot of complaints, complaints about like the Bible and the Old Testament. But even if those things were allegedly true in the way that they object to them, I don't think they understand it when people object in that way. But nevertheless, that wouldn't prove there is no God. It wouldn't prove Christianity is false, right? But here, for the first time in my life, I heard an objection that, if true, would mean that Christianity is false. Now, I say that because Paul said that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then our faith's in vain. Christianity is false. Well, I would also argue that if there is no soul, then by the same token, there can be no resurrection, and according to Paul, Christianity is false. So this is something that really, really troubled me, really shook me, really made me, kind of think deeply about my faith. And I had the option to either brush this under the rug and kind of ignore the objection, or roll up my sleeves and start to dig deep to find answers to these kind of questions or objections. You fast forward now, and the topic of the soul is something that I've probably researched and looked into the most. It's definitely one of my favorite topics, so much so that the last car I bought is a Kia Soul, just because it makes for a good punchline when I talk about the soul.
Nice.
Yeah, and that's what really got me into really studying apologetics and doing what I do now, and how I got to the position I'm in. I can just honestly say it was all God. It wasn't something I was necessarily looking or applying for. It's just God opened the doors. And I pinch myself every morning, being able to be a full-time apologist, being able to provide for my family and do this full time, is quite a dream come true.
Yeah, man. Well, just thank you for what you're doing for the church and strengthening a lot of believers, and just thoughtfully engaging with unbelievers. We'll probably reference this several times, a debate you did with Matt Dillahunty on the soul, and he's a famous atheist, I think in Austin, Texas. He has a show called The Atheist Experience. But before we get to our main topic today, too, on more on the soul, and is there good reasons to think that it is an immaterial existence of the soul, and how that may be a problem for the naturalist worldview. I just want to take a moment to pause and reflect on just the importance of the mind of a believer itself, because I've interacted with different atheists and even Christians who kind of have this mentality of how apologetics is kind of an extra add-on. It's like a bonus. But I've heard recently you share some of your favorite moments, or it really stood out to you over the years since you've been doing this ministry, and that, if you could share some of those, because I think that kind of helps answer how we need to think through loving God with our mind and approaching topics like this.
Yeah, well, one story that I often share, and wouldn't say it's my favorite moment, but like you said, it was really a moment that stuck with me, that I tear up just about every time I share the story. So hopefully I won't hear. But I went to speak at a church once that I was invited to, and prior to the service, I was going to speak to the youth group. The pastor wanted to have lunch with me, and I think well, anyways, to try to keep the story brief. So we're having lunch, and he asked about apologetics. He said, "So, I hear that this is what you do." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I think, that's fine and all that. People want to do apologetics, as a hobby or something." He said, "But I don't think it has a place behind the pulpit. Maybe for a Bible study, but definitely not, behind the pulpit, and certainly not for a Sunday morning. People don't need that kind of stuff." And him being the pastor, I'm not going to argue with them right then and there. And I was a lot younger back then. Anyways, so I just kind of left it at that. Now, he wasn't there when I spoke to the youth group. He just, I guess, wanted to meet me. He wasn't the one that invited me. And before I preached my sermon, it wasn't on apologetics. It was just a traditional sermon, if you will. I did introduce myself and talked about a little bit about what I do in apologetics. And then I said, "But if you have any other questions, feel free to come up to me after the service and ask me." Well, after the service was over, this young man came up to me with his mom, and she looked almost upset. She didn't, almost had that face, I guess you can say, on her. Well, anyways, they walk up to me, and he says, "Go ahead, tell her you said I can ask you questions." And my first thought was, "Uh-oh, what did I say during the sermon? Did I say something wrong?" And I said, yeah, of course. And I said, is everything okay? And his mom said, "Well, as long as you're okay with it, I just had to make sure and confirm that. I'll let you two talk." And she walked away. And I said, "Well, what was that about?" He said, "Well, I'm an atheist, and I come to this church because my mom forces me to. And I didn't want to come, but I came. And since I was here, I thought maybe I could ask some questions, get some questions I have answered." And I would ask, the youth pastor questions, and he didn't have any answers. And I started asking the other students questions and seeing if they had these same questions. And after a while, the pastor and youth pastor sat me down and said, "If you're going to come to this church, you can't be asking people questions. You can't you can't do that. If you're going to come, you have to basically sit there and shut your mouth. Not in those words, I don't think, but that was a sentiment he was giving me. But then he looked at me and said, but you don't come to this church, so you're an exception. And you said we could ask you questions before you preached. So I wanted to ask you questions, and my mom had to come confirm that I did in fact say that. And since you don't come to this church, you're the exception that I can ask questions to. So can I ask you questions? And we talked for at least an hour, up until the point to where, I mean, they pretty much, the person with the key to the church had to basically kick us out because they're like, I got to go home, I got to go eat, I got to lock up the church. The next day I met the pastor for breakfast, and we're sitting down, and I said, Pastor, I know you had mentioned yesterday that you don't think apologetics has a place behind the pulpit, but you have an atheist in your youth group. And he said, yeah. He looks at his plate, kind of giggles, says, yeah, that's so-and-so. We're praying for him. I said, well, it's going to take more than that. I really hope you reconsider your position on apologetics, because this is a small town in Texas. I said, if you lose this young man, you're not just going to lose one person. He's so influential and so smart. He was like a junior, 17 years old, that he's going to take half these kids with him if you lose this kid. And I told him yesterday, if you wanted to keep having a conversation, I could give him my email. So I gave the pastor my card. I said, no, it's your church. I didn't want to be disrespectful. I told the student that I would give you my card, and if you're okay with it, you can pass the card along to him, with your permission. And because he said he had a lot more questions he wanted to ask about. And, he was asking some good questions. Nevertheless, that was anywhere from 5 to 8 years ago. I don't remember the exact year. I never heard from the kid. I don't know if the pastor ever gave him my card, but instances like that just really, really remind me and break my heart as to why we do what we do. I think the modern day church has really dropped the ball in that intellectual life of the mind. One of my favorite books, probably arguably my favorite book, is called Loving God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland. It's an incredible book, but loving God with the mind is part of the greatest commandment. The greatest commandment encompasses your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That mind, that word in the Greek, is literally your intellect, your faculty of understanding. So it's great to get emotional and love him with the heart. It's great to, volunteer and love God with your strength, but we cannot neglect loving God with a mind. And when we do that, there are some dangerous consequences, just as there are with neglecting any aspect of that commandment. And this is something it's not a suggestion, it's a commandment. It's that God is giving us. And if we are to reflect God and be image bearers, then part of bearing the image of God is to have a sharp intellect, and what the Bible says, to be able to answer someone who asks you for the hope that's in you in 1 Peter 3:15.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. That's awesome. And, I may have some people who don't hold to the same worldview as us watching this. And I think it's valuable for them to hear this as well, that they may have encountered Christians or churches that were anti-intellectual, but I want to be clear to make the point that I don't think that's biblical Christianity. Historically speaking, there's some great thinkers in science and philosophy who had a very robust understanding of how all knowledge is integrated together because God is logical. So that's awesome, man, and be thinking through that. And it's just so valuable. Man, I'm blessed that the church I'm at, our pastor, he'll occasionally just share, well, we know this is true because, for example, in the New Testament, we have eyewitnesses. He'll share different reasons kind of sprinkled throughout his messages. So it's a good encouragement to other pastors you listen to understand that really our heart cannot exalt in what the mind rejects. I've heard that from Dr. Stephen Meyer, great author and speaker. And I totally believe that, that they go hand in hand. So, well, let's get into our main topic today. I've had different conversations with people, and actually a high school student, and then another friend, and that would say we don't even know, we don't think the soul really exists. That all that really exists is just matter and what we see. And so they probably need to back up as far as, well, what do we mean by soul, and how do we even know it exists? And I know in your debate with Matt Dillahunty, I think you had several points for that, which again, check that out. It's really good. And so, yeah, maybe you can break some of that down for us, and I'll just be all ears today. So.
Yeah. Well, first, whenever one thing to keep in mind is whenever someone makes a claim that something's true, they bear the burden to prove that. Oftentimes atheists assume that it's only when you make positive truth claims, but no, it's any truth claim. So if someone says only matter exists, my first reaction is prove it, right? Give me evidence for that. And they might say, well, you can't disprove a negative, and that itself is fallacious. You can disprove a negative. But anyways, anytime someone makes a claim, you know, your knee-jerk reaction shouldn't be to start trying to give an argument or object to that, but ask, okay, could you provide evidence? Why do you believe that? Now, when it comes to the soul, whenever I teach on the soul or do debates on the soul, there's always two basic points that I touch on. And, you know, we can only cover so much. There's about a 2.5-hour video I have on my YouTube channel that you can check out, anyone who's listening, where I go more in depth, because it is a complicated topic, just like any other kind of field. And then this is a field of philosophy of mind. Now, there's the two basic points I touch on. Is first is that consciousness is not physical. And the second point is that I am more than a brain and body. And then from those two, I think we come to the conclusion that I am a soul. To the first, and in that debate you're mentioning, I think I give about at least seven arguments, and we can go through a few here. But again, the two basic points are the main thing to keep in mind. To the first one, consciousness is not physical. In order to understand any arguments of this nature, especially dealing with the soul or the mind, consciousness, it's important to understand what's called Leibniz's law of identity. Now, according to Leibniz's law of identity, if two things in question are the same, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. So, for example, if I say Eric Hernandez and the person you're interviewing, well, I'm really just using two different names to refer to the same person, or water and H2O. I'm using two reference, water, H2O, or Eric Hernandez and the person you're interviewing, but I'm describing the same person, right? So whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other. However, by contrast, if you can find something true of one that's not true of the other, then they're actually not the same thing, even if we initially thought they were. The example I like to use is, suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid. One says chemical X and the other one says water. Well, you want to know, are they the same substance? Are they identical? In philosophy, that word identity, when something's identical to something, it means literally the same thing as. So are they the same substance? Well, according to this principle, you look at a thing's properties. And if these two things in question have the same properties, then at the very least, you can say, okay, well, then we know that they're not non-identical. In other words, if they don't have the same properties, they're not the same thing. So let's say I look and I see both of these fluids are clear. They're a clear substance. So I think, okay, I check off, okay, so far I think they're the same thing. But then I turn over chemical X and it says caution flammable. And I think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that these two substances cannot be the same thing. Now, that being said, there's a number of arguments I can give to show that consciousness is not physical. You have anything from intentionality to first person private access, which are all fascinating arguments. But the one I usually just kind of jump to because it's a little bit quicker is if there is no soul and consciousness is going to be something physical, reducible to something physical like the brain, then it's going to have to share the same properties. In other words, consciousness is nothing more than just the brain, then it's going to have the same properties a brain does. But if in principle they don't have the same properties, then we know they're not and they cannot be the same thing. That's a logically deductive perspective. There is no assuming there. You look at the properties, and if they're not the same, then they're not the same substance or owned by the same substance. Okay, so look at the states of the brain versus the states of mind. A state of my mind can be like thoughts or beliefs. There are 5 conscious states. Much like water can come in 3 states, consciousness comes in 5 states. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will, or you can say volition. Now, you look at the state of my mind like a thought or belief. My thoughts or beliefs can have the property of being true or false, but no part of my brain is true or false. My neurons that fire when I have a thought aren't true or false. It doesn't even make sense to ask. My brain can have the property of weighing 3 pounds, but my thought or belief that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy thoughts in this discussion, we're not going to go buy a neck brace after this, right? My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, is not 7 inches long. And I can give dozens of more examples, but the point is clear in that if all the properties of the brain are physical and the properties of the mind are non-physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be reducible or identical to something physical, and it must be immaterial. The next, now once that's established, and I would say that right there, just one example of showing a non-identity would establish that. We can say, okay, now a little bit of metaphysics here. Whenever properties show up in the world, like the property of being red or round or triangular, these are characteristics something has. Whenever they show up in the world, they're always possessed by something more basic than themselves. In other words, the property of redness isn't floating around in the room, and I'm like, oh, duck your head, the property of redness is going to hit you. Instead, what could hit you is an object that possesses a property of redness. So mental states and properties exist, and they're going to be owned by something. So the next question we can ask is, okay, well, what owns these mental states and properties? Well, I know I do, right? Because my thoughts are grounded in a thinker, me. Thoughts have thinkers. So the next question would be, okay, well, then what possesses these conscious states and properties? Well, I do. Well, what does the word I mean? When you use the word, you can write the word I equals, is it brain and body? Is I just a collection of memories? What am I? Now, I would argue here's where you can break it down into a dichotomy, in that you're either something physical, or you're an immaterial substance, which is what I would argue a soul. Now, earlier asked the question, what is a soul? A soul would be defined as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. Now, immaterial substance is something, just what a substance is would be very important to understand in order to understand the arguments. Again, depending on how deep you want to go, let me know. I guess I'll just kind of run through the simpler
good,
version.
Man. Now you're good. It's why it's recorded, right? People can just listen over and over if they need to try to understand it. Yeah, we should probably define too, for some of our listeners who are just getting into these topics, like metaphysics. Can you define that real quick?
Yeah. So it literally just means beyond the physics or after the physics. When you talk about things, a thing's nature or its properties, you're talking about metaphysics. So an easy way to put it, so whether or not numbers exist, the essence of what it means to be the number 2 is that it possesses a property of being even. And this is what's called a necessary or an essential property, which is to say, it doesn't make sense to say that the number 2 could exist without being even, or that the number 2 could lose the property of being even and still be the number 2. If something has a necessary or essential properties, then it cannot be what it is if it loses that property. So because that's in part how we understand a thing's nature. There's a lot deeper we can go into that, but metaphysics is kind of getting at those kind of questions, going beyond the physical. And you even have what's called a priori truths, which are truths that we come to prior to investigation. So everything that has a shape has a size is something I can know in an a priori sense. In other words, I don't have to go out in the world and investigate whether or not that's true. I can know that intuitively by just reflecting on it, and that is a metaphysical principle.
Would you also say like that's a self-evident first principle? Are those the same thing you're talking about?
They're not. They overlap. They're not exactly the same thing, because but yeah, okay. I mean, you're in the right part. Absolutely. I think things that are self-evident, most, if not all the time, would be metaphysical pieces of knowledge that we have.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Sure. Yeah. So so the second part is, so I know I am conscious. I possess these conscious states and properties, but what am I? Now we go to, now I'm either an immaterial substance or an aggregate. So in philosophy, the big word is a mereological aggregate. And what an aggregate is, we can say for short, is it's a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. If there is no soul, then you would have to be something like an aggregate. You are what you are because of the arrangements of atoms put together to form, quote, you. Now, with this in mind, you can put it into a syllogism. One argument would be like the argument from identity through change. So look at something like an aggregate. Again, it's a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. An aggregate's existence and identity is necessarily dependent on its parts and structure, without which it can't exist. So for example, a tricycle has 3 wheels, and it's an aggregate. Things like watches, cars, or Lego bricks would be what we call aggregates. If you take a wheel off of a tricycle, then it is literally no longer a tricycle. It is a bicycle. So what this shows us is that the existence and identity of an aggregate necessarily depends on its parts and its structure. If you rearrange a structure or remove or replace its parts, it's no longer the same thing because aggregates do not maintain identity through change. Now, we can say I am either a purely physical object, aka an aggregate, or I'm a soul, aka an immaterial substance. Well,
so it comes
second
down
premise,
to those two options then, right? Is what you're saying?
yeah, I would say so. Now we can get into another, because what I'm defending here is what's called substance dualism. That
Okay.
when we're talking about human
Right.
persons, we're talking about something that there's a physical substance or component to, and we could say something like matter, my body, but then there's also something immaterial, namely my soul. Which one am I? Well, I'm my soul, and I have a body. So the way to technically put it is that I don't, quote, have a soul. I am a soul that has a body. So I have a body, but I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and a body without a soul is a corpse. And this is where I usually bring in the punchline and say, well, actually, I've changed my position on this. I do now believe that I have a soul, and it's a Kia Soul, and it's orange, and it's sitting in my driveway. And that's pretty much why I bought
That's
that.
funny.
So
I think
appreciate it, people.
This is an interesting point because an aggregate, if I'm understanding it right, you say you cut off a wheel of a tricycle, it's not a tricycle, right? But if you cut off the arm of a human, there's still a human. That's the point you're getting at, right?
Well, yeah, that's and you're getting into the argument already. Absolutely. So so when it comes to those two, like I said, that what I'm defending is substance dualism. You can say that there's two substances to me, if you will. My soul, which infuses a body, a physical type of substance. Now, if I'm a purely physical object, I don't maintain identity through change. So that'd be the second premise. Well, so the question becomes on this argument, do I maintain identity through change? And I think everybody knows that yes, we do. As a thought experiment, it's alleged that every 7 to 10 years, we replace virtually every cell in our body. Now, suppose 7 to 10 years ago, I commit a crime. Let's say it was a murder, and I'm not confessing to that. I'm just, hypothetical. Let's say that happened. And that was 7 to 10 years ago. So, so the cops show up and I say, look, just as well as I do that we're purely physical objects. And whoever that person was that committed that crime 7 to 10 years ago was a different set of cells. And go find him because that's a different person. That wasn't me, but good luck because he doesn't exist anymore. Of course, they're going to laugh at me. They're going to put me in handcuffs and take me to jail because I think that we all know that we are the same person from a moment to the next. Even to what you were saying, if I chop off my arms and legs, am I still a human person? Well, yes, of course I am. And what this shows us is that I am a substance. I am something that, and again, we can go really deep into it, but to try to keep it at a surface level, it shows that my existence and identity is not necessarily dependent on my physical parts for me to exist and be who I am. Again, you can contrast that with something like a car, a tricycle, things of that nature. When you replace or remove or take away or add those parts, their existence and identity changes. For us, that's not the case. Other arguments we can go into something like the indivisibility of personhood. So again, I'm either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or a soul, an immaterial substance. Well, if I'm a purely physical object, then personhood would be a degreed property. Now let's pause there. What's a degreed property? Now I am a person. I possess that property of being a person. That's what I am. And to understand the argument, you have to first understand the notion of what it means to be a degreed or non-degreed property. Things like being hard or soft or loud are what philosophers call degreed properties, which means they can be divided, they can exist in percentages, they can fluctuate. So, for example, something that is the property of being hard can be harder or softer, and something that has a property of being loud can be louder or softer. So these are properties that can fluctuate, they can change, they can come in percentages or degrees, it can be divided. Contrast that with a non-degreed property, which would be something like the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers. They possess the property of evenness. But it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2 because being even is a non-degreed property. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't, and there is no in between. So the question then becomes, is personhood a degreed or non-degreed property? Well, if you're just a purely physical object, then personhood would be a degree of property. Take something like a table and you cut that in half. It would make sense to say that I have 50% of a table, but if you cut me in half or cut off my arms and legs, it wouldn't make sense to say that I'm just 50% of a person. Because if we're just purely physical objects, we're just aggregates, then the property of being a person who would be grounded in something physical. But if it's grounded in something physical, then that is going to make it a degreed property. For example, men are typically larger than women, but would anyone want to say that men are more persons than women? Are they more valuable than women because they have more mass and matter? Or we could basically say, does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Well, no, of course not. Well, if that's the case, then personhood can't be a degreed property. So back to the argument, I'm either a purely physical object or a soul, an immaterial substance. If I'm a purely physical object, then personhood, being a person, would be a degreed property. Being a person is not a degree property. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. So there's a lot more we can go into, but that's a very condensed version of the case without going too deep into the details. Again, consciousness is not physical. I know that I'm conscious. What am I? Am I a purely physical object like an aggregate, or am I something more like an immaterial substance? And I think, from the case that we even just shared here, it would show that I am a soul.
Yeah, that sounds like that has philosophical implications, particularly even in regards to the issue of abortion, because aren't they failing to understand the indivisibility of personhood, right?
The issue of what? Say that again.
The issue that you're saying here, that personhood does not have degrees, right?
That is not a degree of property, right? Being a person.
Yeah. Okay. And so the whole case you were making there, then it seems like failing to understand that, then people would try to argue against personhood and say it's a degree property, saying it depends on the size or the degree of dependency, which they're making it a degree property if you're arguing for abortion. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah. So what's great about this? So there's a book. I don't have it up here with me right now. It's in another room, called Body and Soul by J.P. Moreland and Scott B. Ray. The subtitle is Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics, and it gives a great case for the soul, pretty in depth, but it also shows the implications it has towards ethical issues such as abortion, euthanasia, even things like cloning or in vitro fertilization. All these implications about personhood, and you're exactly right. If being a person isn't dependent on the amount of mass and matter, degree of mass and matter that you have, then it doesn't matter what stage of development you are, you're still a person. And of course, this would go against any type of a pro-choice abortion argument. So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It has implications to so much that, again, we're not even scratching the surface. We're maybe tapping it, what we're talking about here. But absolutely, the implications are profound.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned J.P. Moreland. My understanding, he's one of your favorite philosophers and theologian, right?
Absolutely, he is my favorite philosopher and theologian. He spoke at one of our conferences back in November, and I got to pick him up from the airport and drive him around. So I had J.P. Moreland in my soul a few months ago, and it was one of the best things.
That's funny. Nice. Yeah, I'm just getting into his material. I have one of the books you recommended, The Soul, to encourage our listeners or viewers to kind of hard to see that with the lighting, by J.P. Moreland. And he has another one, Scientism and Secularism, that he came out recently, which is really good. Yeah, so now this is awesome, just thinking through this, because I think I heard you say, and hopefully I'm representing you correctly, that this is more of a philosophical question than a scientific one. And it sounds like you've already made that case, particularly with the law of identity and just showing the consistency in thinking what is needed here. Can you explain that some more of why this is a philosophical issue on the case for the soul?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say this is virtually entirely a philosophical question, and neuroscience has virtually nothing to do or say about it. And that's not just me saying that. Those are some neuroscientists themselves who say that. And there's a number of reasons why. Now, I'm not saying neuroscience maybe can't give us some implications, but the appropriate way to put it here is that any view you take, if I ask you what is a person or what is consciousness, there's different views: physicalism, substance dualism, property dualism, panpsychism, different various range of views. But no matter what view you articulate, they're all going to be what's called empirically equivalent, which means there is no amount of scientific empirical data that myself or someone else that I disagree with, there's no amount of scientific data that we're going to disagree on. We're going to agree on every single piece of scientific data there is, because to the point, it's not a question of science or neuroscience. It's a question of philosophy. We both look at the same data. We both accept the same data. It's just that we have philosophical conclusions that differ, and that's where the metaphysics come in. So these aren't scientific questions about science. These are philosophical questions about metaphysics. Because so someone would say like, well, yeah, but if you hit, if this part of your brain deteriorates, you can lose your memory. And I say, yep,
Yeah,
I agree with that. And that's not like as if, we just discovered that from neuroscience. I'm sure cavemen hit each other over the head with clubs, and they knew that if I hit you over the head really hard, you're going to get dizzy and maybe black out. So it's not like neuroscientists showed us that and nobody knew that. Obviously there's a connection there, but that would, and I might be jumping ahead here, but that's akin to saying something like, put it this way, that's showing a cause and effect relationship, not a relationship of identity. What I was talking about is identity, that A is the same thing as A. Now, cause and effect or dependent relationships are completely different. Say I have a guitar, and in order to play the music, I need a properly functioning guitar. Now, because my way in which I convey my talent is necessarily dependent on a properly functioning guitar, it does not follow that therefore my talent is inside of a guitar or that I am a guitar. Similarly, if you take a piano and you break some keys on the piano, I may now not be able to play the note C, but it doesn't follow that therefore the note C is in the piano. And if you were to break open a perfectly working piano, all these notes would fall all over the floor. So sure, there's a cause and effect relationship, possibly even a dependent relationship, especially while embodied. It doesn't follow that this establishes identity. It just establishes that there's a cause and effect relationship. So yeah, these are philosophical questions, and anything that someone wants to bring up about science or neuroscience, I'm not going to disagree with. Neither would the neuroscientists who believe in the soul. Someone like Jeffrey Schwartz, who is a leading neuroscientist. I think he's at UCLA. I'm not sure if he's still there, but has got tons of money for research and stuff like that. But yeah, perfectly believes in the soul, and it's not as if, because someone might say, well, you just believe in the soul because you don't understand neuroscience. Well, tell that to the neuroscientists and the Nobel Prize laureates who also believe in the soul, who are neuroscientists. So it's not as if, again, just to reiterate, without trying to be long-winded, it's a philosophical question about metaphysics, not a scientific question about the physics.
Now, those scientists you mentioned, do they hold to a naturalist worldview, or are they theist, or where do they land?
So Jeffrey Schwartz is a Christian. He was not always a Christian. I think the other one I'm thinking of, and I'll have to look up the exact names, Karl Popper was the Nobel Prize laureate. Him and I forgot who else he was, wrote something on this. I'm not quite sure their position, but what's interesting is you have even atheist philosophers and even scientists, I believe, who would reject naturalism. And this is where you get what's called the hard problem of consciousness, that if there is no God and all we have is, naturalistic evolution to explain our existence, then where does consciousness come from? I think it was Colin McGinn, who's an atheist, who said, how is it, he's using a parallel of Jesus turning water into wine. He said, how is it that the process of evolution turned the biological tissue into the wine of consciousness? Like, just like Jesus turned water into wine just out of nowhere, like magically. Well, it seems the same way to be with respect to consciousness if there's no God. And he's perfectly right. This is someone who's being honest and humble about this. So, it's not a quote Christian perspective, although I think it's not only perfectly within the Christian worldview, it's foundational to it in a lot of ways. This is something that other philosophers, atheist, agnostic, and of other positions have come to accept. And so, people ask, about the hard problem of consciousness, and my thought is like, well, hard for who? It's if it's just fine on my worldview, it's natural on my worldview. In fact, at the core of what we believe as Christians is that before anything material existed, there existed an unembodied mind, God who is incorporeal. So absolutely, we believe that mind was fundamental and existed even prior to anything physical. So if Christianity is true, then it's not that, I wouldn't even say a step, much less a leap, to believe that we are immaterial beings, and that we are souls that are embodied. So, anyways, yeah, it's definitely one of those things that when again, it's to call it the hard problem of consciousness is almost disingenuous, because it's only a hard problem for those people who would reject something like God.
Yeah. A famous author today, I'm sure you've read and heard him speak, Sam Harris. Isn't he a scientist that he holds to? I'm not sure his view of the soul. What is his view? Do you know?
Not so
He's an atheist, to be clear.
He's an atheist. He's an interesting one, because it does seem like he does hold. Again, I haven't studied his view much. I've seen a few videos, and it's been a while since I have. But he does seem to kind of lean on or imply in believing in something like that consciousness is not physical, kind of a thing. But at the same time, denies free will, and to some extent seems to be a materialist. So it almost seems like he's talking out of both sides of his mouth there, trying to have his physical
have your cake and eat it.
Right. Yeah, have his immaterial cake and eat it too. Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's interesting. And of course, you're bringing up these different scientists, and the root of the issue is that, well, it is philosophical, that it has to be grounded in, as you're saying, the indivisibility of personhood, identity of self through change, and then the argument from the law of identity itself, which is a law of logic as well. So there's a few others I want to get into. I know you've mentioned before, but there's one, while we're on the topic of different views from naturalists. I have a friend who's a methodological naturalist, and he explains how the soul can exist. And I'm going to read the quote I have here from him, because I don't want to misrepresent him. And he says it's kind of like a wave, how it's nothing but the ocean in motion. It forms these things, you break them down. It's nothing but simple vertical oscillations of vertical water molecules, yet it forms huge crashing waves, but it's nothing but water crashing going up and down. So just because its components may be mean or basic, it doesn't mean that they don't together rise above and together form something more important. It says, just like you and I can achieve so much more as a society, we can do more. It's the same thing for our mind. So you'd say, like, the pudding between our ears is just a bunch of fat neurons and electrical pulses, but those are just the components. The mind itself, which we think of as consciousness, our thoughts, our morality, and the emerging world of that, those are the wave. Those are the emergent property made possible by the raw material. And so he said consciousness exists as an emergent property, and immaterial reality is just composed, is just emergent, kind of like a wave. So yeah, hopefully I represent that right. But basically, it's this emergent property of consciousness is my understanding of his position. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So quite a few things to unpack here. First and foremost, emergence is not a solution to the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. It's just slapping a label on the problem, and labeling the problem doesn't fix the problem. So even if what he said is true, which I'll touch on in a little bit, I don't believe it is, but even if what he's saying is true, that consciousness is an emergent property from, essentially, you're going to have to say a rearrangement of my neurons. Okay, but that doesn't explain where consciousness comes from or why it is that it is. So I think it was Jaegwon Kim, who is I think is an atheist philosopher and philosopher of mind, in particularly. He basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that sure, we can show correlations going on here, but correlations are not explanations. They are, in fact, the very thing that need explaining. So just because there's a correlation between a certain neuronal structure that forms a brain that, quote, emerges consciousness, that doesn't explain anything. That just slaps a label to the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. So he hasn't, even if that's true, he hasn't explained anything. All he did was give an analogy to waves and say, therefore, that's how it happens with the brain too. Well, that's not an argument even. That's just a more of an assertion. And I would even say it's even ad hoc. It's begging the question, because you're basically saying, well, consciousness is here. And I don't know, is he an atheist?
Right. Yeah. My understanding. Yeah. Naturalist, methodological naturalism is
right. So
how he described himself.
Right. So basically, you're only working with the natural, so you're not going to bring anything supernatural. So already, as a methodological naturalist, he's limiting whatever his conclusion is going to be to something natural. So already he's already tied his hands behind his back coming into the question, where I think you should just be open-minded to the question, and basically saying, well, consciousness is here. And in my methodology, I'm only going to use natural things. Well, then I guess it just emerged from something natural. Well, that's begging the question. It's assuming it's only going to be something natural. And again, ad hoc, because, well, it can't be God. So either it doesn't exist or it does exist and it's physical. Well, we know it exists. So it just must be that it exists and it's physical, and let's call it emergence and, go home and we can sleep at night. Another thing is the illustration he gave was a textbook good example of what are called structural properties, and which I think is the only game in town for the emergentist, is to appeal to something like a structural property. Now, let me first explain what a structural property is, and then I want to show how this is disanalogous to the mind and how this doesn't work. It's metaphysically not possible for this to be a structural property. So from the beginning, so a structural property, excuse me, would be something like, let's say you have a pile of 10 wooden boards. You could say that these 10 wooden boards have the property of being just a pile of wood. A structural property is a property that, quote, emerges whenever you rearrange a structure or add or take away parts to something. If I rearrange a structure of 10 wooden boards, I can now get a raft. And I can now say that this now is a raft. It has a property of being a raft. Same parts, just a different structure. I can also, take the nails out, the screws out, rearrange it, and then make it into a ladder. And I can say that it now has a property of being a ladder. Now, we can see how these structural properties work, because you're taking the raw material, and within the material, you can even conceive, without actually having to physically do it, you can conceive of what type of emergent property we can get from rearranging the structures. That's perfectly fine. But I would love to see how you rearrange neurons and then consciousness just pops into existence. Alvin Plantinga argued, he has a good paper called Against Materialism that he argued in this. I think John Locke may have argued something like this. Leibniz appealed to something like this. That basically, take the most basic particle, something like maybe a quark. Maybe like a quark or something like that. Well, quarks don't have consciousness. Right. This gets into intentionality. One property of being conscious is that your thoughts and beliefs are about things. That's called intentionality. When I'm hungry, my neurons aren't hungry. I'm hungry, which shows I'm more than my neurons, and I'm not identical to merely neurons. Quarks don't have consciousness. Let's get billions of more of those together. Let's form something like an atom. Atoms don't have consciousness, nor can they possess consciousness. I don't even think you can conceive of something like that. And then you get a bunch of atoms together and you form a cell. Then you get, a whole bunch of these, you get a neuron, and then you get 100 billion neurons. And at 9,000, whatever, 999, no consciousness, but add one more of those bad boys to that and boom, presto, you get consciousness. Yeah. That's essentially what you're going to have to believe to say that consciousness is an emergent property. You're going to have to say that some rearrangement and structure of physical parts, of quarks to atoms to cells to neurons to a brain, and all of a sudden consciousness pops up. I say first and foremost, no, that's ad hoc and begs a question. And the wave illustration he used, if consciousness is not physical, because first, there's a lot. I could spend hours on this, but let me try to simplify. If consciousness is not physical, then water molecules making a wave, sure, I grant that it's a structural property of physical parts rearranging to form a new physical structure. That's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. But you can't tell me that 100 billion neurons put together, all of a sudden you now get a new physical structure, which brings about an immaterial type of a substance or property from this. Again, it's like this. Suppose I have a red brick house made of 1,000 red bricks. How many red bricks do I need to take away or add? And what rearrangement of structure of this red brick house do I have to give it in order to get the color blue? You get the color blue, right. The question doesn't even make sense. It's a category fallacy, because the color blue is not an emergent or structural property that you get from rearranging red bricks or reducing or adding to the number of red bricks. It's not a property that you get about by rearranging a structure. Sure, you can get water molecules together and get a wave, but you're not going to get atoms and cells and neurons and quarks together to get a consciousness. It's just not how it works. So yeah, a lot more that I can say there, but I'll let you push back or follow up or whatever you want.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful thinking through, because it seems like you could say it's a non sequitur then, right? It doesn't actually follow. Sounds like what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the things I had in my notes he was saying as well, that it doesn't mean it can't have effects on the world, an emergent property. But I don't know that, yes, there's an interaction, because you've talked about that. There is an interaction of the cause and effect, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the same in all their properties, I think is one of the key issues we're getting at here, right?
Yeah, definitely one of them. So if you're going to be an emergentist, you're essentially going to have to appeal to something like epiphenomenalism, which is that, sure.
Yeah, he says it's a phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, this position is called epiphenomenalism, which is to say that when you have the right physical conditions of a certain structure of neurons firing together, you get consciousness, but it doesn't do anything. It has no causal effects in the world. And this is something I think that is universal for the epiphenomenalist position, that they would agree that, sure, it emerges, but it doesn't have any top-down effect. It's something that comes from the bottom up that just pops into existence, but it can't change anything because it itself is something that was brought about by this kind of emergence. So sure, we have these thoughts and feelings when these neurons fire in a certain way, which comes prior to the conscious states, but these conscious states themselves don't have any reverse kind of effect to change anything, because it's just like, when you put two chemicals together, you get a reaction. Well, that reaction from the chemicals was brought about by you doing something to these two chemicals. The reaction itself isn't what brought about those two chemicals into existence, if that makes sense. It's those two chemicals
yeah, I
coming
think
together.
I get that. That makes me think of, I think he may also be leaning on studies of where you can look at certain parts of the brain that light up when you're thinking about something. And maybe I'm misrepresenting his view. If he's listening, hopefully not. But I think that maybe where he's going is, okay, you can look at that part of the brain, it's lighting up. And so they're saying, oh, consciousness is emerging out of that. And you've probably heard of that. What would you say to that?
Yeah, there's again, lots could be said here. So here's where we get into an argument from first person introspective awareness, that consciousness is a first person, private, accessible kind of thing. In other words, it's not accessible to a third party. To give an illustration, you and I can look at any object on the table, and you and I both have the equal access to finding out everything we can about this red object. Let's say we had all the money we needed in the world to get the right tools, equipment, microscopes. You and I can both investigate this object and learn about all its properties. But you can't do that with something like consciousness, because consciousness is only available to that person experience, to that first person introspective awareness. Meaning, you put it this way, here's how I heard Moreland put it: a neuroscientist can know more about my brain than I do, but he can never know more about my conscious life than I do. You can open up my brain, open up my skull, open up my brain, and you're not going to know what I'm thinking, just by looking at it in an a priori sense. So the first thing to be said there is, because we're talking essentially about mapping the brain. It's like, I heard a joke once where an astronaut who's an atheist went to space and came back and told this Christian neuroscience, I've been to space lots of times and I've never seen an angel. And the neuroscientist says, well, yeah, I've done, hundreds of brain operations and I've never seen a thought. So let's touch on what he was saying about these certain parts of the brain we know are correlated with things like memory or pain. When C fiber's firing, we know that the person has experienced pain. Now, the first question that needs to be asked is, how did we come to learn this? We didn't learn this in an a priori sense. This is an a posteriori type of knowledge that comes after investigation. And here's what I mean by that. It's not as if a neuroscientist today, let's say we knew nothing about the brain, right? Absolutely nothing. Or let's even go a step further. Let's say there was an alien race out there that existed, which I don't believe there is, but let's say they did, and they're composed of something different than us. Their material is different. Their brains are made of something different. Could we crack open their skull, look at their brain, and know what they're thinking? No, of course not. because that's because consciousness is not something you look at and investigate by looking at something physical like the brain, because again, it shows they're not the same thing. Now you have the same problem with the human brain. So how did we come to learn this? Well, I'm going to oversimplify it. Basically, they'll do something like this. They'll put these things on your head or whatever, and they'll look at your brain scans and look at your brain states, and you'll get a pen and paper, and they say, okay, let's give him a shock or something. You get a shock, and then you look at, okay, his brain is in this state. We're going to call that brain state X. So John is in brain state X. Okay, hey John, when we gave you that brain state, what were you thinking about? He said, puppies and candy canes. He said, okay, perfect. Okay, brain state X, puppies and candy canes. Okay, let's shock him again. Let's try it. Shock him. Okay, hey, John, what did you think? Brain state, yep, what were you thinking? Puppies and candy canes. Oh, fantastic. Okay, yeah, I think we're onto something here. Or they'll say, hey, John, think about, your favorite thing, or think about what you love most. And, okay, look at the brain state. Hey, John, what are you thinking of? Puppies and candy canes. Oh, yeah, I thought it was the same. So what you're doing is you're not looking at the brain and mapping it by looking and seeing consciousness. What you're doing is looking at the brain states, and then as a third party observer, and then asking the person what mental state is associated, what mental state are you in, so I can associate this brain state that I can see to know what to associate it with the mental state that I cannot, because consciousness is not a third party type of thing that could be observed. It's a first person private access type of awareness and introspection.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. That totally makes sense. And some of our listeners may need to go over it again, but I think that section was super valuable. Now we get to, I think, a very important part of the argument for the case for the soul is the ability to make free moral choices. Because I think one of the points I brought up at the Q&A where I asked my friend is, it was a debate on objective morality, what better explains it, Christian theism or naturalism, and or methodological naturalism is his position. But that was part of the reason I was asking is, how can you account for objective standards, objective morality, if you don't have a soul? Because my understanding is, if you don't have a soul, then really you could say you're like a moist robot. You're determined to make choices, and you can't freely have chosen other ways, right? And maybe you can expand on that with the case for the soul and how that ties into how it points to our creator and it points to objective morality being possible.
Yeah. So kind of going back to the syllogism that we're going through earlier, I'm either a purely physical object or I'm an immaterial substance, the soul. I would say if I am a purely physical object, an aggregate, then I do not have free will. So again, this is a premise that it hinges on. The question is, do I have free will or not? Let's just say, to get to the argument, let's say we do. So let's say you do have free will. Okay, so I'm a purely physical object or a soul. If I'm just a purely physical object, I don't have free will. I do have free will, therefore I am not a purely physical object, therefore I am a soul. Now, again, just like the other stuff, we can go as deep as we can, but I'll try to keep it at like a surface level. Setting aside the question of whether or not there is free will, the conditions for free will to exist, first is that you have to be the first mover of your will or actions. So, for example, if you raise your arm and that was you that did it, you initiated the action, then you're the first mover, and we could say you have what's called libertarian free will. But if, let's say, someone tased you that made your arm jolt up, then you were not the first mover. You were merely an intermediate mover that was caused to move by something external and prior to yourself. So in order for you to have what we call libertarian free will, then you have to be the first mover. Now, I think this is necessary for moral responsibility. So let's say someone murders someone else with a gun. Now, technically, we know that it was actually the bullet that penetrated the heart, but we're not gonna arrest the bullet or blame the bullet, even though technically it was a bullet that killed the person. It was just an intermediate mover in a chain of events. Let's go back a step and we say, okay, well, it was fired from the gun. Again, although this might, when I used to say this, I was more confident that I'd say we don't blame the gun, but I worry. So I'm curious sometimes. It makes me wonder. But generally we're not going to arrest the gun or blame the gun because it too was an intermediate mover in the chain of events. Instead, we're going to blame the person because we assume that the person was the first mover in this causal chain of events that caused the gun to fire, that caused the bullet to fire and then to penetrate the heart to kill the person. However, if you're just a purely physical aggregate and there is no God, then the law of what's called causal closure would be true. And according to the law of causal closure, every physical event must necessarily have a prior physical cause. to try to keep it brief. So let's say someone says, okay, but Eric, well, actually it was a neuron firing that caused, me to pull the trigger. And you say, okay, so, well, the brain firing was in me, so I'm the first mover. But all that does is push back the goalposts, because then you ask, well, what caused that brain firing fire to fire? Well, you can, at this point, you're going to have a couple options. The first option is you can say, well, another brain firing fired to call that first brain firing neuron to fire. And then again, well, what caused that one? Eventually it's not going to be an option, because you're going to lead into an infinite regress and the action would never occur. But since we know the action did occur, then it follows that it had to be a stopping point somewhere. Well, this is where you get into your second option, which at some point, no matter how many neurons you want to posit, you're going to have to appeal to something that was external and prior to yourself that caused that neuron to fire, that caused you to pull the trigger, that caused the gun to fire, that caused the bullet to be shot and kill the person. But now, if that's the case, and you're appealing to something external and prior to yourself, you are no longer the first mover. You're merely an intermediate mover. And if we don't blame the gun or the bullet, then we can't blame you, because much like the gun and bullet, you were just an intermediate mover. On top now, so I would say, given that we know people are more responsible for their actions, then I would say that free will does exist. And back to the syllogism, either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Well, if I'm just purely physical object, I don't have free will. I do have free will, because I'm morally responsible for my actions. Therefore, I'm not a purely physical object. Therefore, I'm an immaterial substance, namely a soul. Now, someone might say, well, I reject free will, and that's a whole other issue. But the question I like to ask is, did you freely come to believe that? Because if there's no free will, then the atheist cannot take intellectual pride or intellectual responsibility or rational responsibility for his beliefs. His beliefs were merely determined by chemical reactions that were causally determined by something prior to himself. And he is by default irrational. He can't be rational if this is just something your programmer calls to do. And he is just as rational as a religious nut who shouts in the street corners. Neither chose their beliefs or chose to act in that way. They're just determined to. So you can't take intellectual pride. So basically, again, just to simplify it, if people think that people should be held more responsible for their actions, and if the atheist wants to believe that he freely came to examine the evidence and he is a free thinker and chose to not be brainwashed by religion and think for himself, and he freely came to this conclusion, then free will exists. And if free will exists, naturalism's false and you're a soul.
Yeah, well, yeah, that makes sense. And scripture even affirms that we have the ability to choose, in the sense that we're held morally accountable. Obviously, that's the whole point. Jesus coming is we made the wrong moral choices and rebelled against God, and Jesus says, out of the overflow of out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And yeah, that's interesting, and I think that's such a strong case, because we have to really assume that humans have the ability to have chosen otherwise. In our whole court system, it seems like it's built off of a philosophical foundation, really, from the Christian worldview, and to borrow for objective standards, but then try to live in a methodological naturalist worldview. It doesn't seem that those standards actually exist. If you're consistent is the issue. If you're consistent in that worldview, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. The only place where I would, I guess, give a caveat is, so you referred to some earlier about having the choice to do otherwise, which is known as dualability, or PAP, principle of alternative possibilities. I don't think that's necessary for libertarian free will, but I do think that if one does have the ability to do other than what they did do, then libertarian free will exists and it obtains. So I would say it's a sufficient condition, but not necessary. In other words, even if there was a case in which you could not have done otherwise, as long as you were the first mover of what you did, then libertarian free will obtains. But that might be going deeper than what you wanted to, or stuff like that.
Well, and I think on of course, the key focus on this, because there's a lot of different philosophical stuff, debates and so forth, even related on that. But the key thing on this, we're looking at the existence of the soul disproves methodological naturalism, any forms of naturalism. It doesn't work if you're consistent philosophically, and you should believe in theism, and you should go ahead.
Well, yeah, just interject. Just to be fair, especially if there's unbelievers listening. So methodological naturalism, technically, if the person's being consistent, they're not going to take a position necessarily on whether or
Oh,
not there's
okay.
something
Okay.
immaterial. So in that sense, it wouldn't quote prove it false, but only because it's not claiming that all there is natural things. It's just saying that when any methodology that you do is going to be restricted to the natural processes. But again, that's tying your hands behind your back. But
Okay.
right, and I would argue that the most logically consistent position, if God does not exist, that one should take is a naturalistic evolution, in which you have a rearrangement of physical structures and parts rearranging themselves into more complicated physical structures and parts, but you don't have consciousness, you don't have anything immaterial. So if these things do exist, I would argue that if atheism is true, it would imply that something like naturalism would be true. And given that the soul and consciousness and free will exist, it shows that naturalism can't be true. And if that is something that is most logically consistent on atheism, then I would further argue that it would also show that atheism can't be true as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that caveat, because I don't want to overstate things as well. Man, yeah, this has been helpful, and I just getting us to think through and be consistent philosophically and consistent with that which corresponds to reality. That's how we understand a correspondence theory of truth. Yeah, it's super helpful. You were talking about infinite regress, and I was immediately thinking about, I heard you explain the contingency argument before, and I think I found that interesting, because I've heard some of my same friends who explained that consciousness and the laws of nature and morality are just descriptive, meaning they just are. We don't need explanations for that. Have you heard some version of that before?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, I mean, it depends on what the person's, when it comes to moral values, if they're realist or not. But yeah, I mean, or what part of that are you saying, or maybe unpack the question a little bit further, what you're getting at, or what you want me to touch on?
Yeah, I guess what they're, as far as my understanding was, meaning that we have things that morality, the laws of nature, or even our understanding of consciousness, we're just trying to describe them, but they don't need an explanation, and that explanation doesn't need to be God. Maybe that's a better way to put it, or maybe it's even worse. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I guess to the person who's saying that, I would ask, what I mean, to say we don't need an explanation, I guess I would want to know what they mean by need. I mean, do I need an explanation to live and be conscious? No. But if you want to be a rational person who's thinking through these things, then yeah, I'd say you need an explanation for that. And if the explanation doesn't fit within your worldview, then sure, you can ignore it and brush it under the rug and use the excuse that we don't need an explanation. But if you're going to think about these things and you find that that explanation cannot be found in a naturalistic, atheistic worldview, then you either change your beliefs or give up your worldview. It's that simple.
Yeah, I think, well, that's the hard thing for all of us to swallow, is, can we conform our beliefs to reality? I'm not a Christian just because I want it to be. I want it to be true. I'm Christian because it conforms to reality. It's the best explanation of reality. And even the ability to reason, maybe you can unpack that. It's like reasoning itself. I think that's connected with intentionality as well, and free will. Just being able to reason consistently and rationally, like, how could that be possible in a naturalist worldview?
Yeah, and that would get into an entirely different argument. So again, to not go too long, I mean, in a nutshell, well, let me first say, on my channel, you can look at some debates I've done. I usually use what's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, sometimes called the argument from reason. In my last debate with Skylar Fiction, which I highly encourage people to watch if you can stomach it. I thought it was hilarious and fun, but not everybody's messed up in the head like I am. Because yeah, the guy was getting insulting. I thought it was hilarious and childish. Nevertheless, in some of the debates I've done, the one I would point to would be my debate with David Smalley when I went on his radio program Dogma Debate, and we had a 3-hour debate. I talk about this argument that I'm going to just briefly touch on in a nutshell, because I'll waive the details, but in a nutshell, if there's no God, then your brain was not designed to obtain truth. I mean, that's pretty simple, right? Because it wasn't designed for anything. So I would argue that if there is no God, your brain is not a mechanism designed to obtain truth. If anything, at best, if we want to be very charitable, we can say that it was evolved to produce things that gave us and granted survival value, not truth value. And again, to try and keep it brief, its aim isn't for truth, it's just to survive, and your beliefs don't have to be true in order for you to survive. You can have false beliefs, but as long as those false beliefs grant survival value, then at best we can only say that our beliefs have evolved to and have been passed down to us through natural selection so that we can survive, but not necessarily that these beliefs are true. And it becomes an undercutting defeater in the sense that, okay, I'll get a little, just one step deeper with the illustration. Suppose I wake up from a nap and I look at the microwave and it says 12 o'clock and I form the belief it's 12 o'clock. But then I feel it's really hot in the house. I see that there's water under the fridge and I think, oh, the power must have went out. And then I look back at the microwave and it's actually blinking 12 o'clock. Now here's a question. Is it 12 o'clock? I don't know. Just because a power went out doesn't necessarily mean that it's not 12 o'clock. As they say, a broken clock can still be wrong twice a day. So the fact that I know that my power went out doesn't prove that it's not 12 o'clock. However, it undercuts the validity and justification for any belief that I hold that is based on the reading of the microwave. Now, if that's the case, whatever the microwave tells you, you essentially can't trust it because of this undercutting defeater that removes any justification. In the same way, and again, I'm simplifying it, if there is no God and your brain was not designed to obtain truth, and it's merely adapted at best for survival value, then it follows that any and every belief your brain produces, much like the microwave, has an undercutting defeater for the justification or validity of any belief that you hold. And so if someone believes that there is no God, then that very belief is equally a belief that would be undercutted and they have no reason to believe is true.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm gonna have to watch some of that more too. I think it's interesting, even assuming that the worldview, even if that was true. I mean, of course, to be clear, I don't believe in evolution, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment. That even if assuming that, then it doesn't seem like atheism could be true, right? And that's what you're saying.
Well, so the argument here, again, to be fair, doesn't necessarily entail that naturalism or atheism is false. It just shows that if it is true, we have no reason to believe it's true. And furthermore, we actually have reasons to believe that any belief our brain produces is unreliable, just like, again, the microwave. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah, so that removes any type of rationality, that removes any type of justification, and that removes the possibility of knowledge, because part of what it means to have knowledge is that you have a rational justification. Well, if you cannot by default have a justification for your beliefs, then you could never have knowledge. But here's where it becomes self-defeating. If the person wants to be consistent and the argument is successful, which I think it is, then they're going to have to say that they're going to have to admit, yes, knowledge is impossible. But then once they say that, they're also going to have to admit that they know that knowledge is possible, which means that they now have knowledge. And if they have knowledge, then it would imply that atheism can't be true. Given that if atheism is true, knowledge would be impossible. Well, if I know that, then it follows that knowledge is possible, and therefore atheism isn't true.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting to unpack that too, because I've also heard that extreme skepticism that we should doubt anything that we know, which
I doubt that's a good position to take too.
Yeah, epistemologically, it seems very hard to move forward. Well, man, this has just been a huge blessing for me, and hopefully to all our viewers and listeners. I just want to thank you so much, Eric, for your time. I just want to encourage everybody listening to just give us a like or comment or subscribe, and hopefully share this with as many people as possible and help us get the word out there. So thanks again, Eric. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.